Well, thank you everyone for coming in, and welcome to our event on budgeting for the next generation. My name is Marc Goldwein. I'm the Senior Vice President at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Hope you all can join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. All the way to my left is Heather Hahn, who's a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and one of the authors of their famous Stops at Least Kids Share report, which does a really great job showing just how children fare within the current federal budget. To her right is Bruce Lesley, who's the president of First Focus, an organization that is focused on putting children first. And just to my left is Romina, Boccia, who's the director of the new Herman Center for Federal Budget Policy. I probably got that name a little bit wrong, at the Heritage Foundation. Oh, great. I'd also like to very quickly recognize, I don't see her right there, my colleague Annie Shuppy, who did most of the work for this project, focused on children in the budget, and then had her own child, and so left us to take care of children in the household temporarily, but is here today and coming back soon, and really appreciate all of her work. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has spent about the last year undergoing a relatively intensive project trying to assess the benefits and burdens that we currently face on children in federal policy and in the budget specifically. And you all can read our papers on our website, crp.org, some in our folders. But as we went down this road, it became clearer and clearer to us not only that children receive a small share of the federal budget, which we already knew from Heather's great work and Bruce and Romina's, but also that the budget process itself, we found, is in many ways stacked against children. I'll just give you some quick examples. About 3% of spending on seniors and about 6% of spending on adults is discretionary, meaning we have to appropriate each year. By comparison, about $1 in $5 spent on children, about $2 in $5 spent on children programs is discretionary. So children need to be budgeted for every year, whereas adults and seniors don't. As another example, programs for children are much more likely to be temporary than programs for adults. About a third of all spending on kids comes from temporary programs, compared to only 1/10 of spending on adults and 1/20 of spending on seniors in particular. On top of that, spending for children is generally capped. There's limits on how much we can spend each year. 37% of total spending on children and 60% of spending on children-specific programs is capped, compared to only $1 in $10 spent on adults and $1 in $5 spent on seniors. Spending on children also, relative to spending on adults and seniors, lacks built-in growth. The average growth rate for children's programs is 2 to 4%. By comparison, for seniors, we're talking about average growth above 6%, 2.5%. And lastly, programs for children, unlike programs for adults and seniors, generally lack dedicated revenue source. Right? So some government programs are funded out of a payroll tax or gas tax, etc. Of that dedicated revenue, 71% goes to seniors, 23% goes to adults, about 5% goes to infrastructure, and only 2% goes to children. And the papers in your packets walk through these numbers, but if you think about policy, you get an even clearer picture. Think about healthcare as an example. The healthcare program for the elderly is Medicare. That is an unlimited entitlement. It continues indefinitely. We spend as much as we need. The health program for children is CHIP. That has to be reauthorized often every 5 or 10 years or even less. It has a capped limit and it has no automatic built-in growth. Or taking another example, compare Social Security on the one hand to food stamps and welfare, temporary aid for needy families. Social Security, which mainly goes to the elderly, again, is a permanently authorized program, spends as much as needed under the benefit formula, and grows roughly at the pace of economic growth. SNAP, the food stamps program, which goes about half to children, needs to be reauthorized regularly in farm bills and only grows with inflation. And TANF, the welfare program, which mostly benefits children and their parents, doesn't have any built-in growth, not even for inflation, not even for beneficiary change, and also needs to be regularly reauthorized. So when we look over the landscape of the federal budget process, what we see is that time and again, the programs for children are disadvantaged relative to programs for adults and seniors. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is have each of our panelists talk about their findings with regard to outputs for children, outcomes for seniors, the burdens for leaving them, and then I'm going to ask them some questions and hopefully ask them some of your questions. In your folders, you each have question cards. Please write your name, your affiliation, and your question, and folks will be coming around to collect them. You can raise your hand if you have a question, and I will get to as many as I can before time runs out. So again, thank you all very much for being here, and Heather, let's kick it off with you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to be here. So, as you mentioned, the Urban Institute has this annual Kids Share report, and then we have some other products that are spin-offs of that. And so over the past 12 or so years, with support from the Annie E. Casey Foundation and more recently from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, we have been building a comprehensive database of federal expenditures. And we also have additional aggregate state and local data for a subset of years. But the federal data goes from 1960 to the present, and then, or actually to the prior year, and then we project 10 years into the future. So we have what those expenditures are, and then we, using our simulation models and other expertise, we figure out what is the share of that spending that goes to children. And public investments in children are important. So families and parents provide the most support for their children, but the public investment has a really important role in supporting children's basic needs and promoting equity across children. The goal of the Kids Share series is not to say what amount of spending is the right amount or to advocate for any particular change, but really to provide that detailed information that's needed for people to engage in that debate. So the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget and First Focus and others have used that database as a source of information for other analyses in addition to the analyses that we put out ourselves. So these reports are packed with details of information, but today I want to focus on 5 key points. The first is, what is that kids' share of the federal budget? And in 2017, 9% of federal spending went to children. Almost half of the federal budget, 45% in that year, was spent on retirement and health benefits for adults through Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Another fairly large chunk, 15%, was spent on defense. 7% was spent on interest on the debt, and that's a point I'm going to come back to. And then the remaining quarter was for everything else that the federal government has expenditures on. That 9% of spending for children is up from 1960, when it was about 3%. It reached a peak of 10% during the recession and has fallen since then and is projected to continue falling over the next decade. And that's under current law. If we look at the Trump administration's budget proposals, either for 2018 or 2019, those would have children's spending falling even further in the future. So that's the first point. The second I want to come back to is that spending on interest payments on the debt. In 2020, the interest payments on the debt are projected to exceed spending on children. That suggests a structural problem. The third point is that spending on children is shrinking. As I mentioned, I guess I already made that point in point number 1. And then the fourth point is that most federal support for children isn't in what we think of as children's programs, Head Start and child care. The largest category of spending for children is actually tax credits, and the largest single program is Medicaid. So with tax credits, Medicaid, and the third there is nutrition assistance through SNAP and other programs, that is the bulk of the spending on children, and what we think of as children's programs are a much smaller part of that. And then the final point is that it's really important when we're talking about spending on children to keep in mind states and localities. So states and localities actually provide 2/3 of support, public support for children, almost entirely through public education. But the federal funds are really the primary source of funding for the youngest children and for low-income children. So the federal funding has an important equity role and important across the age spans of children. And also, if you look at that state spending, it varies by state. So the investment in children, in their education and other well-being depends on where they live. So again, the federal spending has an important role in reaching children across the country. I'll stop there and we'll have questions later.
I'm Bruce Lesley, and I'm the president of First Focus, and we're a child advocacy group dedicated to improving federal policy and budget decisions in Congress. So I have a one-pager if people picked it up and that I'll be talking from. So the first thing to note is the work that they do, Urban Institute does in KidShare is different than the work we do in children's budget in some small ways but important ways. So they do a look back period all the way back to 1960 and then a forward look for 10 years. And where they also, where part of what they said was that in 2 years the spending on interest on the debt will exceed all federal spending on kids. We do a 5-year look back and look at individual programs. So in our book, you can find individual programs and see what's going on with each individual program. And then we do an aggregate. And so our number's a little bit different in that, so they talk about 9% of the federal budget. Ours number's 8%, and the difference is that they look at tax expenditures and we don't. We just look at federal appropriations funding. So in that part of the budget, kids are just 8% of the federal budget. As you can see, spending on kids has actually declined over a 5-year period. It's dropped from about 8.2% down to about 8%. And in fact, in 2017, it dipped below 8%. And so why the slight increase in this past year? And it was in large part due to the passage of the Bipartisan Budget Act. And so that did really important things. And one of the things that's important to note is that kids spending tends to be disproportionately on the discretionary side. So when you lift the budget caps, that benefited kids. And so, and then also what happened this year was that we did the CHIP reauthorization and McBee reauthorization and things like that. So an important lesson there is Congress has to take affirmative steps to basically maintain kids or, so that they don't lose ground. And if you look at, if there's the status quo, which the Urban Institute looks at, and nothing changes over the 10-year period, kids would lose substantially. The share of spending would drop dramatically. We already talked about interest on the debt would soon exceed all spending on kids, and of all new spending at the federal level, kids would only be 1%. And the 1% is due to one thing, Medicaid. So their numbers are actually really amazing to look at because they're estimating sort of double-digit decreases in things like education, and that's because the budget caps go back into effect in 2020. So that's a big issue for kids is this issue of the discretionary spending will drop $55 billion in FY 2020 unless Congress takes affirmative action to do something there. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget numbers are also some of those numbers we knew inherently, but not to the extent. So I really urge you all to look at that report because some of those numbers are pretty amazing. And so for us too, I think the lessons for us may be different than other people in the room. I think that for us, the lessons are that programs for senior citizens work. You can look at the poverty rate for senior citizens before. In the 1960s, they were above that of children. We did expansions to Social Security and we did Medicare, and so consequently that's dropped. Kids are still up here, and in fact what we did was TANF, which has been a disaster for kids. So to us, the lesson there is this has worked for senior citizens, and we should look to those kinds of why those things worked for kids. So, and some of those are the very things we're talking about. Kids programs tend to be capped. CHIP is the only federal health insurance program in the country that is capped, temporary. Nothing else is like that. So those are things I think are important lessons. Children are also often a tool for other policy. I would note that HHS during the conversation around health insurance reform, we're actually thinking about repealing CHIP, not because it helps that would help children, but they knew that if they get rid of the insurance markets, that everything would go back into the individual market. And so how can we stabilize the insurance market? We'll use kids. So kids would have been left way worse off, but let's get rid of that program so that we'll move kids into it. A couple of structural solutions I think I'll do, and I'll run through these really quickly, and they're on here, is one is we really think the idea of creating a children's budget at the federal level would be great. There's bills in the Senate that would do that. We love the idea of creating an independent commissioner for children. I think there's a lot of issues right now you can look to that an independent children's commissioner can point to and talk about and raise awareness of. I don't know, kind of maybe even children being caged along the U.S.-Mexico border. That might be a good thing for independent children's commissioner to think about. Creating a child poverty target. There's legislation in the House and Senate to do that. The British have done that, and it's been very effective and substantially cut it. We've also been proponents of creating a new bipartisan commission on children. One was created during President Reagan. It was actually issued during President Bush, but it was bipartisan. People like Bill Clinton were on that. And big things came out of that. I would argue the CHIP and child tax credit. We actually think that we should, in the House, we should recreate a select committee on children, youth, and families. We also like the idea of creating a children's cabinet at the federal level, or maybe even moving some of the children's functions in other areas into the Department of Education to create a Department of Children. And there's some other things, some of the recommendations that CRP have recommended that I'll point to, and then also this issue of CHIP, converting CHIP to basically to make it a permanent mandatory program. One of the things that we've spent now 4 years in the children's community just trying to keep CHIP alive. So what are we neglecting? We're neglecting really important issues like infant mortality and things like that. So the fact that we now reauthorize it for a longer period of time really helps. So with that, I'll...
Thanks. Would you mind turning off your mics?
Thank you for packing the room today on this very important issue. It is immoral for one generation to burden another for its own benefit. Many of you might have picked up this little handy book, federalbudgetinpictures.com. If you look on page 7, a child born this year is already saddled with almost $50,000 in U.S. public debt. This debt finance spending is unjust and unethical. It is impossible for children, for younger generations and future generations to participate in current tax and spending decisions. And yet it is they who must bear the burden of those decisions made today, since we have chosen to finance what mostly amounts to consumption spending on a deficit basis. This is the definition of taxation without representation. Now, why is this happening? Legislators are responsive to the wants of their constituents. You could say politics is working. Nationwide, about 2/3 of seniors turn out for elections. And in some states with a high population of seniors, up to 3/4 of seniors will go to vote. And the U.S. budget reflects senior strength in numbers. About 15% of households are headed by someone 65 or older, but the Congressional Budget Office has found that they receive about 50% of the federal share on spending for transfers, benefits, cash, and in-kind assistance. So the 15% consume 50% of all federal assistance payments. And this should really come as no surprise, because two of the largest federal government programs, Medicare and Social Security, specifically target the elderly. And contrary to the very false but very comforting narrative that individuals who receive Social Security and Medicare benefits have paid for those benefits, in fact, the vast majority of beneficiaries receive far more than they ever paid in taxes for those benefits. Now, something might be said for deficit spending as long as it goes toward investments or towards preserving the union against attacks, foreign and domestic. That might actually benefit children today and in the future. However, most spending since after World War II is not for investments or to grow capital, but rather it's for consumption spending. So basically, the United States is eating up the current capital stock, reducing future prosperity for today's and future children. And if you believe, like I do, that it should be the goal of every generation to pay its own way and to leave a legacy that makes the next generation better off, then you'll understand just how deeply immoral and unethical our current deficit and debt policies are. Why are we allowing this to happen? 2 reasons. One, people suffer from what's called a fiscal illusion. They prefer debt to current taxation. The current generation is not asked to pay for current spending, and rather than internalizing future tax payments from today's deficit spending, that spending is treated as if it's almost free. So we get a larger federal budget than we otherwise would. Meanwhile, the massive costs that we're imposing on younger and future generations are entirely discounted, or if you will, neglected and ignored. Moreover, in the past, we had something of a so-called fiscal constitution that was an established norm that legislators mostly adhered to, except during war times. These norms have weakened, and this is in part due to the emergence of Keynesian stimulus policy, which argued that deficit spending was a good thing to stabilize the economy during an economic downturn. Legislators only heard that first part. Deficit spending is good, let's keep the money flowing. They didn't listen to the second part, which was make sure that you pay that off during economic boom times, and that you're generating surpluses at that time so that over the course of a business cycle you'll actually balance your budget. Instead, Congress is doubling down on deficit spending at a time right now where we have a huge economic boom, very low unemployment. This is the time for the federal government to step back because the private sector is so successful. So what are we going to do about this? I look forward to discussing more specific proposals. In the big picture, I think that because these norms that ensured fiscal sustainability in the past have broken down, we need substitute fiscal restraints that we impose on lawmakers to control today's deficit spending. But imposing statutory fiscal rules like the Budget Control Act caps without bipartisan support and no real commitment from legislators hasn't really worked very well, so they've been evaded multiple times. Same with other budget restraints like pay-go that has been waived with bipartisan majorities. So we need a bipartisan recognition that today's policies are fundamentally unfair, immoral, unethical, and frankly dangerous if you look at the fiscal trajectory our nation is on. And we need to discuss how we're going to protect children and also current generations from this massive deficit and debt accumulation. And lastly, I think for fiscal sustainability in the long run, we're going to need a smart, balanced budget amendment, similar to the Swiss debt brake, which basically balances over the business cycle, allowing for deficit spending when it's necessary during times of economic downturns, but then making sure that that spending is paid back within one generation through surpluses. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for those openings. I'd like to ask a few questions, but I also hope you all ask questions. So if you have any, please write them down in the card, raise your hand, someone will be around to collect them. Let me start with you, Heather. You mentioned that there's something structurally wrong when interest payments exceed spending on children. And you know, one way to think about that is it means we're spending more to service the past than to invest in the future. But the question I'll ask is, from your research, are you noticing that spending in other areas, interest, spending the elderly, is having a crowd-out effect on spending on children? Do you notice any kind of causality? Or is all the spending rising and you know, it's going on the credit card?
So when you look at our revenues versus our spending, we are simply spending more than we're taking in, and that is creating the debt, and that is creating the need to pay interest on the debt. But when we look at where is the spending growing, it is, if you look at the those categories that I initially laid out, spending, the only 2 categories that are growing are the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security for adults, and interest payments on the debt. Everything else is shrinking. So children, defense, and the remainder is all shrinking. And Bruce made this point, but when we look ahead at where there is growth, so I see Gene Sterling is here, and he will always make the point that we are not actually in a time of austerity. We are spending more and more, the federal government is spending more, but where is that increase in spending going? Only 1% of the increase is going to children. And so the share for children is shrinking, where these others are growing and crowding out everything else.
So Bruce, you mentioned a number of solutions. A lot of them, I'm going to shamelessly advertise one of the papers in your folder, because a lot of them seem to match some options that CRFB put forward. What are your favorite one or two? Could you unpack a little more? I was particularly interested in the Children's Commissioner Ombudsman, but you don't have to pick that one.
No, absolutely. I would definitely raise that. I think that one of the things that structurally, I think that one of the great things about your report is it really shows that there's structural barriers for kids, and we also know about societal barriers and other kinds of issues. I mean, kids and political barriers. Kids don't vote. They don't give money to political action committees. They don't, they're not in membership groups to do child advocacy. So they rely on adults to be their voice. And so one of the great things about Children's Commissioner is in other countries that has played a remarkable role in sort of raising issues that are really important to kids and actually giving children voice. That's one of the great roles of commissioners, is to really bring them into the conversation about their own lives and their own future. So that's one thing we really strongly believe, like Australia has such a thing. And just yesterday, I believe, the Australian Prime Minister apologized for the child abuse and neglect that has been going on in the country, and I really do believe that the Commissioner had played a really huge role in causing that attention to be raised to that issue. So that's one of them. Another is to go back to CHIP for a second, is that we literally have spent 4 years working on reauthorizing CHIP and meanwhile neglecting huge important issues with respect to kids. We have an abysmal infant mortality rate in this country, all kinds of things that we should be thinking about with respect to our kids. But we're not, because we're spending all the time just trying to reauthorize the program. And again, we don't do that to any other program. We don't do it in Medicare, we don't do it to Medicaid. But I also think that leads to another one of my recommendations, which is we really are strongly opposed to block granting Medicaid and per capita caps, because CHIP's an example of that, but I would also point to Puerto Rico. Look at what a block grant does in healthcare programs. CHIP, we have a CHIP cliff in 2026, so for all we know, reauthorizing that program could be a saver, or it could cost $100 billion, which means it dies. I don't see Congress coming up with a $100 billion offset just to maintain status quo, let me remind you. And look at Puerto Rico is the other example of policy failure there. So those would be three of, I think, my favorite recommendations of the 14 we made in this presentation.
Thanks. Romina, I'm going to combine a question I was going to ask you with one that I got from someone in the audience. But it's obvious, or at least it's obvious to me, that rising debt is a burden, particularly on younger generations, because when the bill comes due or when we pay interest, they're going to pay it. On the other hand, many of the proposals to reduce debt, for example, the person points to the president's budget, would actually significantly reduce spending on children. So how do we hit that balance that we're reducing the burden on children without taking all that money from children, or is that a worthwhile trade-off?
I think it's worthwhile asking where are those funds best spent and administered, and I believe that would be on the state level. And Puerto Rico has a lot of other problems, including not being able to provide power or water to their population. So we shouldn't be surprised that a block grant may not have worked very well in that setting. I don't think that necessarily the Medicaid services with a different financing structure would be much better because of the governing issues you find in Puerto Rico. As to the budget, The president's budget, President Trump's budget, I think neglects important reforms in the major entitlement programs that are the primary drivers of growing spending and debt. Social Security and Medicare in particular. It does make some reforms in Social Security disability insurance. I hope we'll see those build out. In terms of the spending reductions, the reduction in children's programs you pointed to, if that budget was enacted, which the Congress has shown absolutely no interest in doing so, would come primarily from reductions in non-defense domestic programs. Many of those activities are poorly managed at the federal level and should be accounted for at a state level. And I was actually interested in hearing what states are the most generous towards children. Heather, if you have research on that. There's a reason why we have a federalist system. The country is based on this idea of having various laboratories of policy. And states do spend the majority of their budgets on programs for children, primarily education programs. And even in those instances where we've been spending more and more money, the educational outcomes for children have been actually abysmal. So school choice is one other option that seems to work better for many children that are otherwise being left behind in certain communities. So yeah, overall I think we ought to, instead of talking about how we can make more programs mandatory, which is the primary driver of our already growing spending crises that will ultimately burden younger generations, with that burden, whether the spending is on children's programs or programs for the elderly or corporate welfare, whatever it might be, the deficit will ultimately burden younger generations. We should be talking about having overall more congressional deliberation over how money is spent, what it is spent on, and prioritizing between various government programs. So one of our recommendations for the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform right now is to review what programs are categorized as mandatory to narrow that designation to such a degree that we have more congressional deliberation and prioritization among the federal budget rather than allowing programs to go on autopilot.
Thank you. So this question is for any of you. This is from Denise in the audience, and Denise basically asks if we should start dividing children into two categories. She suggests children under 13 and children that are 13 to 19 or 13 to 26. So we call them adolescents because they have very different and distinct, but also major needs. What are we oversimplifying by lumping all kids together?
I think that dividing them in that way also would be an oversimplification. As I mentioned, there is already this difference in the level of investments by the federal government versus states based on age. And the federal government provides about a third of the total public investment in children, but it's 3/4 of spending on infants and children, and about 1/4 of the school age, and about half and half for preschoolers. So actually, if you were to split it, I actually think it's the 6 to 18 that would be the more logical split. But I still feel like that could be an oversimplification because a lot of these programs are not age specific.
Great.
Do you want me to address your question about the state spending?
Yeah, please.
So we do have a report called something called Leveling the Playing Field. Leveling the Playing Field is something in the title. It's on our KidShare website if you go there, where we looked at state-by-state differences in aggregate spending. And the thing that really jumps out at us there is that the states where there is a growing child population, particularly in the Southwest, are the states that historically have invested less in children. And there is a shrinking child population in the Northeast where there has historically been a greater investment in children. So I think as that population shifts occurs, unless there is a change in policy, which I wouldn't expect, I think we will see less state investment in children.
So So one of the interesting things is there's definitely high correlations with the idea of investment in kids and success. So you can look at the states where there's higher investments in kids, and the Annie Casey Foundation has a report called Kids Count, and there's huge correlation between where you're putting investments in kids and outcomes. And so the outcomes in the Kids Count report are certainly higher in those states than they make investments in kids than in the Southwest, where there's actually where all the growth is. And so exactly as Heather's point, one of the people, I have huge concerns about what's going on in Texas in terms of child policy, and people ask why. One is I'm from there, but the other big reason is in the last decade, half the growth in the country is from Texas and kids. So if Texas fails its kids, that hurts the entire country. And so I think that result causes two kind of policy things. One is there then is an important role for the federal government to play to promote equity and to really, let's face it, there's some states that just won't, there's some states that have no early childhood programs. And if there wasn't a federal program there would be nothing for those kids. And so that's an important thing. And I think also there's been some really interesting work done by William Frey from Brookings, right? Yeah, he's Brookings. And he's done some really great stuff on this idea of a cultural generation gap or racial generation gap. And there's high correlation between high spending states and outcomes in kids count. There's even higher in what are racial generation gap states. So the states with a higher racial generation gap, which means a disproportionate number of senior citizens who are white versus minority population kids, those states actually make less investments in kids than other states. And it's actually a really surprising set of states. And the only outliers in that racial generation gap things are like states like New Jersey. Well, that's because they're under court order. There's actually a decision that required equity. So it really does point to some really important policy solutions, and part of that is how do we bridge those gaps? How do we make senior citizens and other populations understand the importance of investing in kids, and it's in their own interest because they're the ones who are going to be paying for Social Security and Medicare in the future. And also the other thing that's really important is the intergenerational programs. And so I would point to Medicaid and Social Security. Social Security, it should be noted, it now lifts more kids out of poverty than TANF. So like people always think about TANF as being the child poverty program. It does a very poor job of lifting kids out of poverty, and part of the reason is it's a block grant and it has not had any increase in funding since 1996.
So this is another question from the audience. Bruce, you recommended creating a children's budget. The questioner is, does this suggest the executive branch is unaware of how much it requests for programs and services for our kids? And then the related question, which might be better to ask one of the other two, is are there any drawbacks to this new process that Bruce is recommending?
We're really excited about the idea because we would take Kids Share in our report, children's budget, to various White Houses, and every single time, so the answer to the question is no, they don't know. Like we would take it to the Obama administration, we've taken it to people in the Trump administration, they have no idea. So the problem with kid programs is they're so siloed. So the individual staff people at the White House may know, and even in Congress may know, oh, I know what's going on with child care, or I may know what's going on with juvenile justice, or I may know what's going on with job programs or healthcare programs, but they have no idea about the overall number. Like we walked into the Obama administration one year and showed them that they were at like a 10% increase. And they're all like, wow, we had no idea. And it was because they were making huge investments in their budget around child care and other things. Same goes with the Trump administration. There's a great article this morning by Catherine Rampal from the Washington Post about what's going on with the deficit and what may happen. I would point to on our second slide, the Trump budget would actually drop kids spending down to 6.89. And when we went and met with them and talked to them about that, they were like, oh, well, we had no idea. And it's because, why does that happen? I think one of the reasons what's really great about a children's budget is it forces people to look at that number. And administration may decide, I don't really care, and issue it anyway. But I think that even people who are cutting the budget for kids would at least have to pause and think about it and go, oh, I had no idea. Like even in the rescission package that came up, right, we're going to cut $25 billion. Where was half of the savings coming from? It was kid programs. And so it's the easy place to cut. And so I think that the children's budget would at least force people to at least have to look at it and acknowledge that that's what they're doing.
And Romina or Heather, any drawbacks of a children's budget?
I think transparency overall is a good thing. We should know what we're spending money on and how much. We also want to look at whether what that money buys us and whether the programs that we're paying for have the intended outcomes. This is one of the reasons that we have recommended eliminating Head Start funding in our blueprint for balance, is because randomized controlled trial experiments have shown that it hasn't had the intended outcome. And it's not just about your intention and how much money you're spending on certain populations, but it's also about what outcomes are you observing with those funds. So this gets at another issue. Should we have a children's budget, or should we have more of a portfolio budgeting approach where we're considering all of the various ways in which the federal government is involved in various aspects of the economy? And I do think that states and localities can be much more responsive to changing populations and to changing needs of their populations rather than a federal one-size-fits-all approach. What we also find in the federal government is that there's a very little collaboration between various agencies that are responsible for similar or the same population. There are a number of federal agencies have programs specifically dedicated to children or individuals with disabilities, but they don't work with each other. And in terms of the disability programs for children, SSI has a terrible track record of helping those young people get into the workforce, integrate them in the broader social and market sphere. So some of these programs actually have bad outcomes for those populations. So yeah, more transparency is a good thing, but let's not mistake more money for better outcomes.
So,
Can I say just a quick word on
yeah,
this?
right.
So just a quick word on transparency. So I don't agree on the Head Start thing. Obviously, I think we should be making more investments there. But an example, I do agree with the concept of transparency is important and really looking at good and bad. So we're not all about just increasing spending on kids. I'd also point to an example of even this issue of warehousing kids on the border. There's way cheaper ways to do that, and so under this budget, ORR spending, putting kids in basically cages along the border is far more expensive than other ways. And so I like the idea of the transparency route, having that all in one place. It would allow us also to look at ways to save money, and there's ways to do what we're doing in terms of border enforcement and things like that in a much better way and much cheaper and actually in the best interest of the children themselves.
And also on the issue of outcomes, I mean, Urban Institute is all about evidence and program evaluation. I'm a big proponent of measuring outcomes, but I think we have to be careful when only some programs' outcomes are measured and not others. And if we are measuring outcomes for children's programs, and what standards are we holding them to? What level of improvement or return on investment is necessary to support that program? I think the more that we are focusing on outcomes just for children's programs, we are shortchanging those children. When maybe if we're going to be measuring outcomes, we need to be measuring outcomes across all of our expenditures, including the mandatory spending, not just the discretionary spending.
So, Romina, you brought up, and others have sort of alluded to the idea of portfolio budgeting, which is to take a more holistic look. So you're not just measuring how much we're spending, but we're looking at how we're spending and how we're also regulating and taxing, et cetera. I'm going to use that as a very poor segue because that's one of the options we put forward. Another one is something called incremental budgeting. And the idea here is to look at how much we're spending this year and then track that forward to see how much of our growing revenue is going to various areas. And this is Gene Sterling, who's here, asked the question, how much was it incremental budgeting? Sort of if we already had the new information about kids, how much would that help the outcomes? Do you think that helped outcomes for kids relative to other groups?
Well, since 85% of the projected spending increase over the next 10 years is basically accounted for by major health care, Social Security, and interest on the debt, yes, I think it would be very telling to see where those spending increases are going and how that's being accounted for. That would certainly show the decline in other discretionary appropriations, including programs for children, though I still think that the federal government really doesn't have a major role in providing programs for children. That should be done more on the state and local level.
So I like that concept, and I've heard, and I don't want to misquote you, Gene, but I like the, I've heard Gene talk about it, and sort of the idea is that it's not like we're not going to have new revenues. It's not, the amount of spending we're going to have at the federal level is not going to be less in 10 years necessarily, and so it is, I think, important to think about how we're spending that increase, and so is it okay with us that 1% of all future spending over the next decade is on kids? It's not. I don't think that's a great investment in our future. And is it okay that interest on the debt will grow at 19 times that? And so I do think that budgets do represent your values. I think Joe Biden used to say that all the time, and I think that's true. And so I think it does get at that issue. Is like, do we? For kids, that's sort of a double hit then, because kids not only are then not getting the investments, but they're going to be the ones that are being asked to pay off the debt. So kind of looking at that and thinking about that, I think that's also another value of the children's budget, because it would really highlight that and what that'll share about.
So two separate questions point to, I think, identify one of the main issues here is that children don't vote, right? And so that puts them at a political disadvantage, all else equal. And Denise asked the question, what do you all think? She doesn't say you all, but
she's from the South, she said y'all.
Right. I'm from Philadelphia, say you guys, but I've learned to say y'all. So she says, what do you think about reducing the age to 16? And Christina similarly asks, how do we get those that are over age 55, who are going to represent the majority or a plurality of voters, to care more about what's happening to their children and grandchildren? So if any of you want to take either of those questions.
Sure.
So I love the idea of kids voting at 16. I'm a huge proponent of that. But even more than that is, I have 3 kids in college, and it's outrageous how we treat kids in terms of voting. States, the voter suppression of college students is unbelievable. Like the rules that kids have and the threats about, what's your real home? Are you a college, you should probably register back home, and even though that they're at school for 9 months of the year. Yes, I'm for, having kids 16 vote. But even more, it would be really nice if we would just promote democracy among our young adults. The issues that face them are very similar to those for kids, and so those kinds of things. I think that I would say when I started, I think we were talking earlier about this, but when I started, I would not have said that issues around voter suppression and gerrymandering and those kinds of things were a kid issue. I would say about 5 years ago, I was like, they're a huge kid issue, because the populations being suppressed, like college students, are definitely disproportionately advocates for kids in polling and other things. And so having that voice and it being lost is tragic, and I think it's tragic for our future, because if they don't vote as college students and young people, they're also thinking about issues around family formation. They are thinking about kids all the time, and so not including them is a tragedy.
So you may know Tacoma Park, Maryland is a place where 16-year-olds can vote in local elections. And I think part of the thinking behind that was that high school students are really engaged and have a lot of political opinions. And so having 16 and 17-year-olds be able to vote gets them engaged in that democratic process and starts to build that experience and build that expectation that they will vote.
In addition, I think doing more intergenerational accounting of our projected fiscal gap and how various policy changes distribute the burdens of that fiscal gap, of the difference between what we're projected to spend and what we're projected to take in tax revenues. I think that would be an important part to add to this conversation. It's not clear always the choices that we face if we don't look at them as a comprehensive whole. So for example, changes like let's lift the payroll tax cap in order to shore up the financing for Social Security. That is a massive tax increase on working age Americans. And at the same time, it doesn't do anything to resolve the much larger fiscal crises that we have in healthcare. So to consider how we're distributing, to the extent that we're going to make an attempt at solving our fiscal gap before we face a severe fiscal crisis or potentially concealed default on our debt through inflation, which is another option sovereign nations like to use when they can control their own monetary supply. If we actually want to resolve this in a responsible way, we need to consider the trade-offs we're making when we're considering various policy options, from benefit changes to tax increases and who will be impacted by each.
So one of the solutions options we put forward, we suggested, was to create a select committee on children, similar to select committee on aging. And Bruce, I know you mentioned something similar. Ann Queen asks, are there any steps in place right now to create such a committee or to create a cabinet level position?
I don't know of any that are being considered right now, but I would say that if, in the next Congress, that would definitely be something the children's community should consider asking leadership in Congress to recreate. There's also other ways that I think would be really interesting for Congress to think about. The British also do a children's parliament, and they have kids come in, and they're actually elected from all the congressional districts across, well, not congressional districts obviously, but the districts in the UK. And they go to Parliament, and they actually debate issues, and they vote on them, and then they make those recommendations. And having that voice is amazing. Some of the recommendations they have, I think adults think, oh, we were all kids, so we know what's going on with them. They came up with things that people would not have thought about. And we impose issues upon kids all the time, and really should be listening to their voice. I thought the Children's March a few months ago was amazing, because the only people that were allowed to speak were the kids. Way more powerful, and yet, all the solutions, some of the solutions being proposed would be things that kids think are terrible ideas. But in the Children's Parliament, they came up with some really great, things that you would, you're like, oh, that makes sense. And for example, seniors in the UK get discounts on the tea, right? The students voted, well, what about kids? Like, we take the tea too. We don't have funding. They pointed out, in terms of, now we have this huge national park system. They pointed out things like, kids don't get a break, and I can even point that out to my own family. My in-laws, who have way more money than the rest of us, got in for $6, and then all of us came in with our kids, and we were being charged $50 to get into the same national park. It was like, really? So those are kinds of things that kids see, and they see it all the time, and having their voice, I think, is really critical to doing policy around them. They're the ones, they're the ones that can tell us about things about sexting and bullying and things like that, and so we're all making policy around that stuff. They know what's going on, and we don't listen to them, and so any ways we can have those voices, and I think having a select committee and having that voice raised, but even other kinds of ideas like having a children's parliament, or I think are really important for us to consider. Children's commissioner, obviously. So
Krista asks if, and this is specifically to you, Bruce, but I'm going to make the question more interesting. She asked if you have any ideas for how to improve TANF to make it more adequate for children. But I'm going to make the question more interesting by asking more broadly, what policies for children could be improved without changing the overall spend? So where are we not spending as well on children as we could be? And I'll ask that question to all of you.
Just one area where the federal government actually has a role in education, and that's the Bureau of Indian Education, the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, and they have some of the worst outcomes for children, and I got to see some of it myself in the Grand Canyon, in the Supai village. And the parents are already doing their best to hire tutors with the limited funds that they have. So education savings accounts that are available for other children who live in Arizona would be huge. But that is a federal government issue, and the federal government has been neglecting those children and their education incredibly. It's really sad to see. So more funding in that space hasn't necessarily helped. It's also about who controls those dollars and who is in the best place to make the best decision for those children, which I believe are the parents at this point.
So on TANF, I would say a couple of things. I said earlier that SSI actually lifts more kids out of poverty than TANF. It's not even a goal of TANF to address child poverty. So one thing we'd love for TANF to be is to make that a very clear goal, and I would say we should have a child poverty target added to TANF and make that, when you measure something, you actually get activity around it. And so it would be really great if TANF had a child poverty target, and that was a goal, an agreed upon goal of this nation, that it's not acceptable that 1 in 5 kids in this country live in poverty. The other really bad thing about TANF, it was a block grant set in 1996, so it was based on spending levels there. There's a massive inequity, and in fact, it's even grown because the states who actually had lower spending per child in 1996, they're the faster growing states. So the inequity has actually increased, and so the ability for some states to actually address child poverty is far less. And then of course, the fact that we have the same exact amount of money as we did in 1996, the amount available to actually make investments has dropped by 40% if you take into account inflation. So those three things would be things I would change about TANF.
Yeah, I would second all those things about TANF, that it's really not supporting children very well. Very few people who are eligible for it actually receive it, and what they receive is very small. So I think there are a lot of improvements there.
Okay, so Jim asks, how can we consider all of these issues in the context of our current political environment and changing demographics? And in particular, he points to the fact that with a declining share of our population is children and an increasing share of children that are from minority populations and going to public schools.
So I would say that's a huge issue. So back to this issue around the cultural generation gap or the racial generation gap, we need to be making more investments in our kids, and we need to be paying attention to these demographic issues and what we're doing around that, because they are, it's a cliche, but it's true. They are the future, and if we're not addressing the unique needs that a growing minority population of children are facing, and we're not embracing diversity as a nation, then we're lost, because that's who our future is. The majority of kids below the age of 9 now are minority. So if we don't understand that and we're not thinking about that and investing in that, then we're making a tragic mistake for generations. So I do believe that that's a really important issue, and it's also, it's interesting because the number of kids are actually not declining, they're actually still going up. It's the share of kids are declining because of the rapidly aging baby boomer population. So, but the number of kids are actually still increasing. And so, I was looking at numbers in Texas, and it's just crazy. They've not only cut funding since 2010 on their schools, but then because Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the country, they're $2,000 per kids below what they'd spent in 2000. So they're, now they got classes at 35, 40, and again, that's where the growth is. If we're failing those kids in Texas, we're all harmed. Go ahead.
And you were saying that the share of children is shrinking, but not as fast as the spending on children is shrinking, which gets to the shrinking per capita. And I feel like I just keep saying, yeah, what Bruce said, but but I wholeheartedly agree. We need to be thinking about all of our children and investing in all of our children.
Just one small point, it's actually minority and low-income children that benefit the most from having access to school choice, from being able to pick better schools where they can be safe and learn in an environment where they can actually succeed. So school choice is expanding in the States, and we should build on that success so that all children have the ability to succeed. And I also think that traditional public schools are not training our children for the future of work. So more module-based education that's targeted to the individual is also something that school choice can enable.
Can I add one thing? So I strongly disagree with that. I think that publics are the failure of our making investments in public schools is a disaster, and some of these ideas of vouchers and things are taking money away from schools. Our investments in public schools, and those are kids who are minority, and on top of that, this whole testing and accountability mess. We just had a whole conversation about Flint, Michigan, and the lead in the water and the disaster that has been for kids. Well, what's been going on is that states are taking over the school systems, they're taking over the cities, and whose neighborhoods are those? Whose schools are those? Those are majority minority kids that these states are taking over and then destroying democracy in those areas. And so would the state of Michigan take over a bunch of white schools? No, they don't. They're taking over black and brown schools. And basically when Flint took back their city, they didn't even have furniture. They basically gutted their city. And so then we wonder why we have lead in, and then why Congress then has to act, because we're allowing basically a gutting of democracy in a very different way that we should all be thinking about, be very concerned about.
So I got my 3-minute warning about 6 minutes ago. But if you all want to do about a 15-second closing each, I'm going to cut you off. So Heather, if you want to start.
2 seconds, all right.
You go first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Given the rising pressures on our budget, we should all think about how we can reduce the burden of current spending and borrowing on the younger generation.
Perfect. You 2 seconds left.
I think transparency and information sharing around these facts that would be clear with the children's budget and children's commission and so forth, just raising awareness of these issues is an important first step.
I'll just leave you with a quote by Robin Brill, which is a society's destiny rests on how it treats its children, and I think we need to be cognizant of it, and when we're thinking about public policy related to kids, we need to think about the best interest of the child.
Please join me everyone in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.